Elizabeth Zamora clutched her 7-month-old son closer to her chest as the stagecoach rattled over the uneven terrain of West Texas. The year was 1878, and she was running out of options as quickly as she was running out of money. Her husband's blood had barely dried on the dusty streets of San Antonio when his creditors came knocking, demanding payment for debts she never knew existed. They'd taken everything: the house, the furniture, even her wedding ring, leaving her with nothing but her child and the clothes on her back. The coach hit a particularly deep rut, jolting Elizabeth forward. Her son, Michael, stirred in his sleep but didn't wake. Thank heavens for small mercies. "First time to San Angelo, madam." The elderly woman sitting across from her smiled kindly, her face a map of wrinkles carved by the harsh Texas sun. "Yes," Elizabeth replied softly. "I'm hoping for a fresh start." "Ain't we all?" the woman said with a knowing nod. "Lost my husband in '71, came out here to live with my daughter. San Angelo's growing fast, plenty of opportunity for a young woman with gumption." Elizabeth offered a weak smile in return. Gumption was about all she had left. That, and a desperate plan that made her stomach twist with anxiety every time she thought about it. The coach rolled into San Angelo just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the main street. It wasn't much different from other frontier towns. Elizabeth had seen a jumble of wooden buildings flanking a wide, dusty thoroughfare. Men in cowboy hats lounged outside saloons, while women hurried to finish their errands before nightfall. Elizabeth disembarked carefully, balancing Michael in one arm while retrieving her single valise with the other. "Need help with that, madam?" the driver offered, but Elizabeth shook her head. "I can manage, thank you." She had to manage. There was no one else to rely on now. The Western Star Hotel stood at the far end of the main street, its weathered sign creaking in the evening breeze. It wasn't much to look at, but the advertisement in the newspaper had promised clean rooms at reasonable rates, and that was all Elizabeth needed: a place to regroup and figure out her next move. The lobby was sparsely furnished but clean. Behind the front desk, a balding man with spectacles looked up from his ledger. "Room for the night?" he asked, eyeing her and the baby with mild curiosity. "Yes, please. The cheapest you have." Elizabeth set down her valise, shifting Michael to her other arm. He was getting heavier by the day. "That'll be 50 cents. Name?" "Elizabeth Zamora." The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mexican husband. He was half Spanish," she answered stiffly. "He passed recently. My condolences." The clerk's tone softened marginally. He pushed a key across the counter. "Room 3, top of the stairs, first door on your right. Washrooms at the end of the hall. Breakfast is served from 6 to 8. Elizabeth thanked him and made her way upstairs. The room was tiny, containing nothing more than a narrow bed, a washstand, and a rickety chair, but it was clean, as promised. She laid Michael down on the bed, surrounding him with pillows to prevent him from rolling off, then sank into the chair with a weary sigh. From her valise, she withdrew a folded newspaper and smoothed it open on her lap. The advertisement was circled in pencil. "Wives wanted. Ranchers, farmers, and businessmen of good standing seeking respectable women for matrimony. Inquire at Widow Jensen's boarding house, Main Street, San Angelo." Elizabeth had read it so many times she knew it by heart. Marriage to a stranger wasn't what she wanted, but it might be Michael's only chance at a stable life. With no family, no money, and no prospects, Elizabeth was willing to sacrifice her own happiness for her son's security. Tomorrow, she would visit this Widow Jensen and see what could be arranged. Tonight, she would pray for courage. Morning arrived with the sound of wagons rumbling down the street below, and the aroma of coffee wafting up from the hotel's dining room. Elizabeth washed and dressed herself and Michael with care, wanting to make a good impression. Her black morning dress was simple but respectable, and she'd managed to keep Michael's clothing clean despite the long journey. After a breakfast of cornbread and coffee, Elizabeth gathered her courage and asked directions to Widow Jensen's boarding house. It wasn't far, just 3 blocks east of the hotel, a 2-story white clapboard house with green shutters and a neat front garden. A bell tinkled as Elizabeth pushed open the door. The foyer was cool and dim after the bright morning sunshine. A plump, gray-haired woman emerged from a back room, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good morning. May I help you? Are you Widow Jensen? I've come about the advertisement." Elizabeth held up the newspaper. The woman's face brightened. "Indeed I am, and you've come to the right place. I'm Martha Jensen. And who might you be?" "Elizabeth Zamora. And this is my son, Michael." Martha's smile faltered slightly at the mention of the child, but she recovered quickly. "Well now, that does change things a bit. Not many of our gentlemen are looking to take on another man's child. But come in, come in. Let's have some tea and discuss your situation." Elizabeth followed Martha into a cozy parlor furnished with horsehair sofas and antimacassars. After serving tea and settling Elizabeth with Michael on her lap, Martha produced a leather-bound ledger. "Now then, Mrs. Zamora, I run what you might call a matrimonial bureau. I keep a list of respectable men looking for wives, and I match them with suitable women. I've arranged 17 marriages in the last 2 years, and 15 of them are still happily together." Martha beamed with pride. "What happened to the other 2? Elizabeth couldn't help asking. "One husband was killed in a cattle stampede, poor soul. The other marriage." "Well, some matches don't take, even with the best intentions. But I'm very careful about the men I work with. They must provide references and proof of their financial stability." Elizabeth nodded. "I appreciate your thoroughness. My situation is urgent. My husband died 3 months ago, leaving substantial debts. I have no family to turn to, and I need to provide for my son." Martha's eyes softened with sympathy. "I understand, my dear. It's a hard world for a woman alone, especially with a child to raise." She tapped the ledger thoughtfully. "Most of my gentlemen are seeking young women to help establish households and bear children of their own. The fact that you already have a child might be a deterrent for some, but not all." She flipped through the ledger, muttering to herself. "Too old, too particular, wants only a virgin bride." "Ah, here's a possibility." Martha looked up with a smile. "Yates Lawson. He's 32, owns a cattle ranch about 15 miles outside of town. Good Christian man, doesn't drink to excess or gamble. His first wife died of fever 2 years ago. No children from that marriage." Elizabeth's heart quickened. "He sounds suitable." "He's more than suitable, he's a catch," Martha corrected. "His ranch is prosperous and he's well respected in the community, but he's been particular about finding a new wife. Wants someone with, as he puts it, refinement and education." "You speak well, Mrs. Zamora. Were you educated?" "Yes. My father was a schoolteacher in Boston. I attended the Boston Female Academy until I was 18. Martha clapped her hands together. "Perfect. Mr. Lawson will be in town tomorrow for supplies. I could arrange a meeting if you're interested." Elizabeth looked down at Michael, who was contentedly chewing on his fist. For his sake, she had to be interested. "Yes, I would like to meet Mr. Lawson." "Excellent. Come back tomorrow at noon. Wear your best dress and perhaps mention your education right away. It will impress him." As Elizabeth rose to leave, Martha added gently, "And Mrs. Zamora, be honest about your circumstances, but perhaps don't emphasize your husband's debts. Men appreciate honesty, but they don't need to know every detail right away." Elizabeth understood the unspoken advice. Make herself appealing first, reveal the complications later. It felt dishonest, but she was in no position to be squeamish about such things. "Thank you for your help, Mrs. Jensen. Call me Martha, dear, and good luck tomorrow." The next day, Elizabeth dressed with care in her one good dress navy blue with a modest bustle and white lace at the collar and cuffs. It wasn't the latest fashion, but it was dignified and flattering. She arranged her dark hair in a simple chignon and pinched her pale cheeks to bring some color to them. Michael was fractious that morning, perhaps sensing her anxiety. Elizabeth walked him around the small hotel room, singing softly until he finally dozed off. She would have to bring him to the meeting. There was no one she could leave him with. At precisely noon, Elizabeth presented herself at Widow Jensen's, her heart pounding with trepidation. Martha ushered her into the parlor where a man stood looking out the window. He turned as they entered, and Elizabeth's first impression was of height. He towered over her by at least a foot. Broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, he had the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His face was tanned, with crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, and his hair was the color of straw, streaked with gold from the sun. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was something compelling about his steady blue gaze. "Mr. Lawson, may I present Mrs. Elizabeth Zamora," Martha announced. "Mrs. Zamora, this is Mr. Yates Lawson." Yates stepped forward and gave a small bow. "Mrs. Zamora, a pleasure to meet you." His voice was deeper than she expected, with a slight drawl that marked him as a native Texan. "Likewise, Mr. Lawson." Elizabeth's own voice sounded thin and nervous to her ears. Martha beamed at them both. "I'll just go prepare some refreshments and give you two a chance to get acquainted." She bustled out of the room, closing the door behind her with a meaningful look at Elizabeth. An awkward silence descended. Yates cleared his throat. "Please sit down, madam." Elizabeth perched on the edge of the sofa, adjusting Michael in her arms. The baby was awake now, regarding Yates with solemn brown eyes. "Your boy?" Yates asked, nodding toward Michael. "Yes, this is Michael. He's 7 months old." Yates sat down across from her, his large frame making the delicate parlor chair look like dollhouse furniture. "Mrs. Jensen tells me you're recently widowed. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. It's been difficult." Elizabeth wasn't sure how much to reveal, but honesty seemed the best policy up to a point. "My husband was ill for some time before he passed. The medical expenses were considerable." Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Life has a way of dealing hard blows when we least expect them. I lost my wife to fever 2 years ago. Happened so fast I barely had time to call the doctor." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said, and meant it. There was genuine grief in his voice. "It was God's will," Yates said simply. He studied her for a moment. "Mrs. Jensen mentioned you were educated in Boston." "Yes, my father was a teacher. He believed in education for women as well as men. A progressive thinker." Yates smiled slightly. "I respect that. My ranch keeps ledgers, you know. A wife who can read and figure would be a help." Elizabeth's cheeks warmed at the implication that she might become that wife. This conversation was moving faster than she'd anticipated. "Mr. Lawson, I should be frank with you. I'm not just looking for a husband. I'm looking for security for my son. My husband left me in difficult circumstances." Yates leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Mrs. Zamora, I appreciate your honesty. Let me be equally frank. I'm not just looking for a wife. I'm looking for a partner, someone to share my life and my home. My ranch is profitable, but it's lonely work. I've put off remarrying because I didn't want to settle for just any woman. I wanted someone with spirit and intelligence." His gaze was direct, assessing her. "You seem to have both. As for your boy, I've always wanted children. If you became my wife, I'd raise him as my own." Elizabeth's breath caught. Could it really be this simple? "You barely know me, Mr. Lawson." "True enough. But I'm a good judge of character, had to be in my line of work. You strike me as a good woman in a bad situation. I can offer you and your boy a comfortable home, plenty to eat and protection. In return, I'd expect a well-managed household and companionship." He paused, then added quietly, "And in time, perhaps more children." Elizabeth blushed deeply at the implication. Of course, any husband would expect a physical relationship. Was she prepared for that? Her marriage to James had been more practical than passionate. The idea of intimacy with this stranger made her pulse quicken with a mixture of anxiety and something else she couldn't quite name. "I understand," she said softly, "but surely you'd want more time to consider. We've only just met." Yates smiled, a slow warming of his features that transformed his face. "Mrs. Zamora, I've spent 2 years considering. I've met with half a dozen women Martha thought might suit, and none of them felt right. You do. But if you need time, I respect that." Martha returned with a tray of coffee and cookies, beaming at them both. "How are we getting along?" Yates stood. "Very well, I think, Mrs. Zamora needs time to consider, which is only proper." He turned to Elizabeth. "I'll be in town for 2 more days, taking care of business. If you decide you're interested, I'd like to court you properly, brief as it might be. Perhaps dinner tomorrow evening." Elizabeth found herself nodding. "That would be acceptable. Good, I'll call for you at 6. With a tip of his hat to both women, Yates took his leave. As soon as the door closed behind him, Martha turned to Elizabeth with barely contained excitement. "Well, what do you think? Isn't he wonderful? He seems kind," Elizabeth said cautiously, "and straightforward." "He's all that and more," Martha assured her. "Honest as the day is long, and generous too. Helped rebuild the church after the fire last year and never asked for recognition." She sat down next to Elizabeth. "Did he offer for you?" "Not exactly. He suggested we might suit, and he invited me to dinner tomorrow." Martha clapped her hands together. "That's more than he's done with any other woman I've introduced him to. You must have made quite an impression." Elizabeth wasn't sure how to feel about that. Part of her was relieved that Yates seemed genuinely decent and was willing to accept Michael. Another part was terrified at how quickly things were moving. "It's all happening so fast." Martha patted her hand sympathetically. "Life doesn't always give us the luxury of time, dear. Sometimes we have to make decisions quickly and trust in God to guide us." She looked at Michael, who was beginning to fuss. "You have more than yourself to consider now." That was precisely what worried Elizabeth. If she made the wrong choice, it wasn't just her life that would be affected, but her son's as well. "Think about it overnight," Martha advised. "Pray on it. The Lord will guide you." That night, after putting Michael to bed, Elizabeth sat by the window of her hotel room, gazing out at the star-filled Texas sky. She had prayed, but no clear answer had come. Yates Lawson seemed decent, and his offer was generous, but marriage was a lifetime commitment. Could she bind herself to a man she barely knew, even for Michael's sake? The alternative was bleak. A life of drudgery and poverty, always one step ahead of destitution. At least with Yates, Michael would have a roof over his head, food in his belly, and a man's influence as he grew. By morning, Elizabeth had made her decision. She would have dinner with Yates, and if her impression of him remained favorable, she would accept his offer. The following evening, Yates called for her at the hotel precisely at 6. He had cleaned up considerably since their first meeting. His blonde hair was neatly combed, and he wore a dark suit that, while not fashionable, was well made and dignified. He even brought flowers, a small bouquet of wildflowers tied with a ribbon. "For you," he said, presenting them with an almost boyish awkwardness that Elizabeth found oddly endearing. "Thank you. They're lovely." She took the flowers, inhaling their sweet scent. I'll just put these in water before we go. Take your time." Yates knelt down to look at Michael, who was sitting on a blanket playing with a wooden horse. "Hello there, young man. That's a fine steed you have." Michael regarded him solemnly for a moment, then offered the toy to Yates with a gurgle of delight. "Thank you kindly." Yates pretended to gallop the horse across the floor, making Michael laugh. The sound of her son's happiness made Elizabeth's heart constrict. It had been too long since she'd heard him laugh like that. The restaurant Yates took her to was the finest in San Angelo, a small establishment attached to the Grand Hotel that catered to travelers and the town's elite. Elizabeth felt self-conscious in her plain dress, but Yates didn't seem to notice or care. He ordered for both of them steak, potatoes, and greens, and was considerate enough to request a bowl of mashed vegetables for Michael. Over dinner, they talked. Really talked in a way Elizabeth hadn't expected. Yates told her about his ranch, the Triple L, named for his father and grandfather, both also named Lawson. He spoke of the challenges and rewards of raising cattle, of the beauty of the land, and of his hopes to expand his operation in the coming years. In turn, Elizabeth told him about her childhood in Boston, her father's progressive views on education, and her love of literature and music. She even found herself sharing stories about her brief marriage to James, how they'd met at a literary society meeting, his charm and ambition, and how those same qualities had ultimately led to his downfall when his business ventures failed. He wasn't a bad man, she concluded, just reckless with money and too proud to admit when he was in over his head. Yates nodded thoughtfully. Pride's a dangerous thing. Bible calls it a sin for good reason. He hesitated, then asked gently, "Did you love him?" The question caught Elizabeth off guard. "I respected him, and I cared for him. We were compatible in most ways." "But did you love him?" Yates persisted. Elizabeth looked down at her plate. "I thought I did at the time. Now I'm not so sure." Perhaps it was more the idea of him, the cultured businessman who could offer me a life of comfort and intellectual stimulation. She met Yates' gaze. "Love is a luxury not always afforded to women in my position, Mr. Lawson." "Yates," he corrected softly. "If we're to consider a life together, you should use my given name." "Yates," she repeated, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "I want to be clear about something, Elizabeth." His use of her first name sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "I'm not offering you just security or convenience. I want a real marriage, not just on paper but in every way." Elizabeth's cheeks flamed. "I understand. Do you?" His blue eyes were intense, searching hers. "Because I don't want you to agree to this out of desperation, only to regret it later. That wouldn't be fair to either of us or to the boy." His honesty was both intimidating and refreshing. "I don't know if I can promise you love, Yates, not right away, but I can promise respect, loyalty, and my best effort to make a good home for you and for Michael." Yates nodded slowly. "That's a fair start. The rest can grow in time." After dinner, Yates escorted Elizabeth and Michael back to the hotel. At the door to her room, he didn't try to kiss her, but took her hand instead, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "I'll be leaving for the ranch tomorrow afternoon. I'd like your answer before then, if possible." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "You don't need to wait. My answer is yes." Surprise and pleasure flickered across Yates' face. "You're sure? I don't want to rush you, I'm sure." She wasn't, not completely, but she'd analyzed the situation from every angle and couldn't see a better option for Michael's future. "When would you want to? That is, when should the wedding take place?" "As soon as can be arranged," Yates said firmly. "No point in waiting. The preacher can marry us tomorrow morning and we can be at the ranch by nightfall, tomorrow." She would be Mrs. Yates Lawson by this time tomorrow. The thought was dizzying. So soon? Unless you need more time to prepare. Elizabeth glanced around the sparse hotel room at her single valise and Michael's few belongings. "No, I don't need more time." Yates squeezed her hand. "Then I'll make the arrangements. I'll call for you at 10 tomorrow morning." After he left, Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, her heart racing. She had just agreed to marry a man she barely knew, to move to his isolated ranch, to share his life and his bed. For Michael's sake, she told herself firmly. This was all for Michael. But as she lay awake that night, listening to her son's soft breathing, Elizabeth wondered if perhaps there might be something in this marriage for her as well. Yates was kind, stable, and honest, qualities she'd come to value far more than the charm and sophistication that had attracted her to James. And there had been moments during their dinner when conversation flowed so easily, when his smile had warmed something inside her that had been cold for too long. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was a beginning. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Elizabeth dressed Michael in his best clothes, a tiny suit that had belonged to a cousin's child, passed down to them before James died. For herself, she chose her navy blue dress again, with the lace collar freshly washed and pressed. At precisely 10, a knock came at her door. Yates stood there, looking imposing in his dark suit, his hat in his hands. "Ready?" he asked simply. Elizabeth nodded, gathering Michael and her valise. Yes. The ceremony at the small white church on the edge of town was brief and unceremonious. Widow Jensen stood as witness, beaming proudly as if she'd personally orchestrated a love match. The preacher, a weathered old man with kind eyes, read the vows with dignified simplicity. When Yates slipped a gold band onto Elizabeth's finger, his first wife's, he'd explained apologetically, but he would buy her a new one when they next came to town if she preferred the metal felt heavy and strange. She hadn't expected a ring at all. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher intoned. "You may kiss your bride." Yates bent down, his hands gentle on her shoulders, and pressed his lips to hers in a brief, chaste kiss. It was over almost before it began, but it left Elizabeth feeling oddly breathless. "Mrs. Lawson," Yates said, offering his arm. The name sounded foreign to her ears. It would take time to get used to it. After the ceremony, they loaded Elizabeth and Michael's meager belongings into Yates' wagon. He'd purchased a few necessities for them, a warm blanket for the journey, a sturdy hat to shield Elizabeth from the sun, and a small wooden toy for Michael. "The road to the ranch is rough," he warned as he helped her and Michael up onto the wagon seat. "But the view at the end is worth it." The journey took nearly 5 hours, most of it along a rugged trail that wound through scrubland and low hills. Elizabeth held Michael tightly as the wagon jolted over rocks and ruts, grateful for the sturdy arm Yates occasionally extended to steady her. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they crested a hill and Yates pulled the wagon to a halt. "There it is," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "The Triple L." Below them, nestled in a shallow valley, lay a sprawling ranch. A large, well-maintained house of hewn logs and stone stood at its center, surrounded by several outbuildings, corrals, and a barn. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwood trees. In the distance, cattle grazed on the open range. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said, and meant it. After months of uncertainty and fear, the solid permanence of the ranch was deeply appealing. Yates smiled, pleased by her reaction. "My grandfather built the original cabin. My father expanded it, and I added the stone section 5 years ago. It's a good house, sturdy." As they approached, a middle-aged Mexican woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's Maria," Yates explained. "She and her husband, Diego, have worked for my family since I was a boy. They live in the smaller house behind the main one. Maria cooks and helps with the house, and Diego is my foreman." Elizabeth felt a surge of relief. She hadn't been sure what to expect in terms of household help, and the presence of another woman was reassuring. Maria greeted them warmly, her dark eyes curious as she assessed Elizabeth and Michael. "Welcome, Senora," she said, her English accented but clear. "I have prepared dinner in your rooms, plural." Elizabeth glanced at Yates, who cleared his throat. "I thought you might like your own room at first," he said quietly, "until you're more comfortable." Tears pricked Elizabeth's eyes at this unexpected consideration. "Thank you," she whispered. The house was larger than it appeared from the outside, with a spacious central room that served as both kitchen and living area, and several bedrooms branching off from it. The furnishings were simple but solid, with a few unexpected touches of refinement: a Boston rocking chair by the fireplace, bookshelves filled with well-worn volumes, and a small piano in one corner. "It was my mother's," Yates explained, following Elizabeth's gaze to the piano. "Do you play?" "A little," she admitted, "though I'm out of practice. I'd like to hear you sometime." There was a wistfulness in his tone that touched her. Maria had prepared a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. They ate at the large oak table in the kitchen. With Michael settled in a makeshift, high chair Yates had constructed from a regular chair with books piled on the seat, and a belt to secure him. After dinner, Maria showed Elizabeth to her room, a pleasant chamber with a large bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the creek. An adjoining smaller room had been hastily converted into a nursery for Michael, with a small cot and a chest for his clothes. "Senor Yates made the cot himself, yesterday and today," Maria informed her with a knowing smile. "He worked very hard to finish before you arrived." The thought of Yates laboring to prepare a bed for her son touched Elizabeth deeply. It was such a practical, thoughtful gesture, exactly what Michael needed, not an empty, romantic overture. After Maria left, Elizabeth unpacked their few belongings and settled Michael for the night. He was overtired from the journey and fussed a bit before finally falling asleep. Elizabeth sat beside his cot for a while, watching his peaceful face in the lamplight. Had she done the right thing, bringing him to this remote place, tying both their fates to a man they barely knew? A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Yates stood in the doorway, holding a small package. "I thought you might like this," he said, offering it to her. "It's not much, but it might make things feel more like home." Elizabeth unwrapped the brown paper to find a framed photograph, a family portrait showing a stern-faced man, a gentle-looking woman, and a young boy she recognized as Yates. "Your family," he nodded. "Taken in '58, just before my mother died." "I thought it might go on the dresser so you'd know who came before, but if you'd prefer not to have it—" "No," Elizabeth interrupted. "It's perfect, thank you." She placed the photograph on the dresser, adjusting it slightly. "It's important for a home to have history." Yates' expression softened. "That's what I've always thought." He hesitated, then said, "I'll say good night then. My room is across the hall if you need anything at all." After he left, Elizabeth changed into her nightgown and climbed into the unfamiliar bed. It was comfortable, the sheets clean and smelling faintly of lavender. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, so different from the city noises she was accustomed to. Instead of carriage wheels and distant voices, there was the chirping of crickets, the occasional lowing of cattle, and the soft rustle of the cottonwood trees in the breeze. She was married again. Mrs. Yates Lawson, mother to Michael Zamora Lawson now, she supposed. It all felt like a dream, unreal and slightly terrifying. But when she thought of the alternative: poverty, uncertainty, possibly even having to give up her son if she couldn't provide for him, she knew she'd made the only choice possible. Elizabeth closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer of gratitude for this sanctuary, unexpected as it was. Then, exhausted from the emotions and events of the day, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The first week at the Triple L settled into a routine more quickly than Elizabeth had anticipated. She rose early, as was the custom on the ranch, and took breakfast with Yates before he headed out to work with the cattle. Maria arrived mid-morning to help with household chores and cooking, and to coo over Michael, who had immediately won her heart with his sunny smiles. Elizabeth spent her days learning the rhythms of ranch life, exploring the house and its surroundings, and caring for Michael. The vastness of the Texas landscape both intimidated and exhilarated her. After the confined spaces of city life, the endless horizon felt like both a freedom and a challenge. Yates returned in the evenings, tired but always taking time to ask about her day and to play with Michael before dinner. Their conversations were still somewhat stilted, both of them careful not to tread too deeply into personal territory, but there was a growing ease between them that Elizabeth found comforting. They continued to sleep in separate rooms, though Elizabeth was acutely aware that this arrangement couldn't and shouldn't last indefinitely. Yates had been clear about wanting a real marriage, and Elizabeth had agreed to those terms. The question was not if, but when. On the 7th day after their wedding, a Sunday, Yates surprised her by announcing that they wouldn't be riding into town for church services as she'd expected. "It's too far for a weekly journey, especially with the boy," he explained over breakfast. "We go in once a month for supplies and services together, but we do observe the Sabbath here at home." After breakfast, he led her to the porch, where he'd set up 3 chairs, 2 adult-sized and a smaller one that was clearly meant for Michael when he was a bit older. For now, Elizabeth held him on her lap as Yates opened a well-worn Bible. "My father always read from the scriptures on Sundays, whether we made it to church or not," Yates explained. "I'd like to continue that tradition if you don't mind." "I think it's a lovely tradition," Elizabeth said sincerely. Her own father, though not particularly religious, had believed in the moral value of biblical teachings. Yates read from the book of Ruth, his deep voice giving weight and dignity to the ancient words. "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." The passage struck Elizabeth with unexpected force. Wasn't that exactly what she had done? Followed this man to his home, taken his people as her own, not out of love as Ruth had followed Naomi, but out of necessity. Yet the result was the same: a life uprooted and replanted in foreign soil. When Yates finished reading, they sat in companionable silence for a while, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. Michael dozed in Elizabeth's arms, lulled by the gentle rocking of the chair and the warm morning sun. "I've been thinking," Yates said finally, "that it might be good to invite some neighbors over next Sunday, just the Hendersons and maybe the Wilsons, so you can meet some of the local folks." Elizabeth's stomach tightened with anxiety. She hadn't considered how she would be received by the community or what they might think of this hasty marriage. "Do they know about us? How we met?" Yates glanced at her, understanding in his eyes. "They know I went to town looking for a wife, if that's what you're asking. It's not uncommon in these parts. Women are scarce, and a man needs a helpmeet. And they won't think it's strange that you married a widow with a child. They might be curious," Yates admitted, "but they're good people. Once they meet you and Michael, they'll understand why I chose as I did." The confidence in his voice eased Elizabeth's concern somewhat. "Then I'd be happy to meet them." Later that afternoon, while Michael napped, Elizabeth found herself drawn to the piano. She hadn't touched the instrument since her arrival, partly out of respect for its status as a family heirloom, partly because she wasn't sure if Yates would welcome the noise. But today, with the peaceful Sabbath quiet wrapped around the house, she felt bold enough to lift the cover and run her fingers lightly over the yellowed keys. The piano was slightly out of tune but still playable. Elizabeth began with simple scales to warm up her fingers, then moved into a Chopin nocturne that had been a favorite of her father's. She was so absorbed in the music that she didn't notice Yates enter the room until she finished the piece and heard him clear his throat behind her. "Don't stop on my account," he said, his expression unreadable. "That was beautiful," Elizabeth blushed. "I'm afraid I'm very rusty and the piano needs tuning. I wouldn't know the difference." Yates moved closer, his eyes on the instrument rather than her. "My mother used to play every evening after supper. Not fancy pieces like that, just hymns and folk songs. I remember sitting at her feet, watching her fingers move across the keys like they had a mind of their own." A smile softened his features. "She tried to teach me once, but my hands were too clumsy. Better suited to roping cattle than playing Bach," she said. The image of a young Yates struggling with piano lessons made Elizabeth smile. "Perhaps you just needed more practice." "Perhaps." He met her gaze then. "I'm glad you're using it." "A piano should be played, not just looked at." "I could teach Michael when he's older if you like," Elizabeth offered. "Every child should have some musical education. I'd like that very much." Yates hesitated, then added, "And I'd like it if you'd play in the evening sometimes." "If you don't mind." "I don't mind at all." That evening, after dinner, Elizabeth played again, simpler pieces this time, folk tunes and hymns that Yates might recognize. To her surprise, he began to sing along in a pleasant baritone, his voice blending harmoniously with the music. Even Michael seemed entranced, bouncing in Yates' lap and waving his tiny hands as if conducting it was. Elizabeth realized with a start, the first time the three of them had felt like a family. The next Sunday, the Hendersons and Wilsons arrived for dinner after their own home church services. Elizabeth had spent the day before baking bread and pies, and Maria had prepared a roast with all the trimmings. The Hendersons were an older couple with grown children who had moved east for work. Henry Henderson was a cattle rancher like Yates, though on a smaller scale. His wife, Ruth, was a plump, cheerful woman who immediately took Elizabeth under her wing, offering advice about everything from treating snake bites to preserving vegetables for the winter. The Wilsons were younger. Thomas Wilson was only a few years older than Yates, and his wife, Sarah, was expecting their third child. Their two boys, aged 4 and 6, were delighted to have a new playmate in Michael, though he was still too young to do much more than watch their antics with wide-eyed fascination. "We were so pleased when Yates told us he'd found himself a wife," Ruth Henderson said as they worked together in the kitchen. "After Rebecca died, we were afraid he might never remarry. He took it so hard, you know." Elizabeth nodded, uncertain how to respond to mentions of Yates' first wife. It was an awkward position to be in, the second wife, always living in the shadow of a ghost. Ruth seemed to sense her discomfort. "Oh, don't mind me chattering on. Rebecca was a lovely girl, but that's the past. You're his present and future, and we're all just tickled to meet you." She patted Elizabeth's hand. "And that little boy of yours is an absolute cherub. Yates always wanted children. It like to broke his heart when Rebecca died before they could have any." In the adjacent room, Elizabeth could hear the men discussing cattle prices and weather predictions for the winter. Yates' voice carried a note of quiet authority that she was beginning to recognize, not domineering, but confident and knowledgeable. "Your husband's one of the most respected men in the county," Ruth continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "When the bank in San Angelo was threatening to foreclose on the Martins last year, Yates stepped in and paid their note. Didn't want anyone to know, but word gets around. The revelation didn't surprise Elizabeth. In the short time she'd known him, Yates had demonstrated a strong sense of responsibility toward those in his care, from his ranch hands to his neighbors. "He's a good man," Elizabeth agreed softly. "And he looks at you like you hung the moon," Ruth added with a knowing smile. "I'd say you both got lucky in this match, arranged or not." Elizabeth blushed, startled by the observation. Did Yates really look at her that way? She hadn't noticed. But as they gathered around the table for dinner, she found herself watching him more closely. The way he pulled out her chair, the gentle hand at the small of her back as he guided her to her seat, the pride in his voice as he introduced her to his friends, these were not the actions of a man merely fulfilling a contractual obligation. The realization was both flattering and terrifying. What if Yates was developing genuine feelings for her? What if he expected the same in return? Elizabeth wasn't sure what her own feelings were, beyond gratitude and growing respect. There was a physical awareness. Certainly Yates was an attractive man, and she wasn't immune to his presence, but was that enough to build a real marriage upon, as if sensing her scrutiny? Yates looked up and caught her eye across the table. He smiled, a private smile meant only for her, and Elizabeth felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with anxiety. That night, after their guests had departed and Michael was asleep, Elizabeth and Yates sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. The evening was cool but not cold, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "Thank you for today," Yates said after a comfortable silence. "The house hasn't felt so alive in a long time." "I enjoyed meeting your friends," Elizabeth replied. "They're good people." "The best." Yates' voice was warm with affection. "Out here, neighbors are more than just people who live nearby. They're your support system, your community. We rely on each other." Elizabeth understood. It was so different from city life, where one could live for years without knowing the names of the people in the next apartment. "I like that, the sense of connection. It's one of the things I love most about ranch life." Yates shifted in his chair to face her. "Elizabeth, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." The serious tone of his voice made her pulse quicken. "Yes. Are you happy here, with this arrangement with me?" His blue eyes searched her face in the dim light from the oil lamp hanging by the door. "It's been 2 weeks, and I've tried to give you space to adjust, but I need to know if you're content or if you're just enduring." The question caught her off guard, but she appreciated his directness. "I am content," she said carefully. "More than I expected to be, honestly. You've been very kind to me and to Michael. Kindness is a starting point, not a destination." Yates ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Elizabeth had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "I told you before that I wanted a real marriage, not just a convenient arrangement. I meant it then and I mean it now, but I don't want to rush you if you're not ready." Elizabeth swallowed hard, understanding what he was really asking. It had been over 2 weeks since their wedding, and they were still living more as housemates than husband and wife. "I am your wife, Yates," she said softly, "in name and in law, and I agreed to all that marriage entails when I accepted your proposal. That's not what I'm asking." His voice was gentle but firm. "I don't want you in my bed out of obligation. I want you there because you want to be there." The bluntness of his statement made her blush, but Elizabeth appreciated his honesty. It was one of the qualities she admired most about him. "And if I'm not sure what I want," Yates considered this, his expression thoughtful, "then we wait until you are sure." "I've waited 2 years to find the right woman. I can wait a bit longer for her to find me." He reached out and took her hand, his palm warm against her cooler skin. "But I hope you know that I care for you, Elizabeth, more than I expected to this soon. You and Michael both." The confession, simple as it was, made Elizabeth's throat tighten with emotion. "I care for you too, Yates," she whispered. And it was true, she realized with a jolt of surprise. In just 2 weeks, this taciturn cowboy had carved out a place in her heart with his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, and his unwavering integrity. Yates brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, a courtly gesture that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "Then that's enough for now. The rest will come in time." But as Elizabeth prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking not of time and patience, but of the warmth in Yates' eyes when he looked at her, the strength in his hands when he helped her down from the wagon, the timbre of his voice when he sang along with her piano playing. She thought of the care he took with Michael, the respect he showed her, and the home he had built that was becoming her own. Perhaps, she reflected as she slipped between the cool sheets, she was already closer to being sure than she had realized. The turning point came 3 days later, in the early hours of the morning. Elizabeth was awakened by a frantic pounding on the front door. She slipped from her bed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and moved into the hallway just as Yates emerged from his room, pulling on his shirt. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice tense. "I'll see who it is." But Elizabeth followed anyway, worry overriding obedience. From the top of the stairs, she watched as Yates opened the door to reveal Thomas Wilson, his face pale and drawn in the lamplight. "It's Sarah," Thomas said without preamble. "The baby's coming, but something's wrong. She's bleeding bad, Yates, real bad. Our boys are still asleep, and I didn't know who else to turn to." "I'll ride for the doctor," Yates said immediately. "It'll take me at least 3 hours round trip, though." "I'll go with you," Elizabeth said, descending the stairs. Both men turned to look at her, surprised by her presence. "To help Sarah. I've assisted at births before." It wasn't strictly true she'd been present when a cousin gave birth, but had done little more than fetch water and towels. Still, she couldn't bear the thought of Sarah suffering alone while the men rode for help. Yates hesitated, then nodded. "Get dressed quickly. I'll saddle the horses." Within minutes, Elizabeth had donned a simple dress and boots, checked on the still sleeping Michael, and asked Maria, who lived just behind the main house, to watch him. Then she and Yates were galloping across the moonlit prairie toward the Wilson ranch, with Thomas a few yards ahead, his fear driving him at a reckless pace. The Wilson homestead was smaller than the Triple L, a modest one-story house with a barn and corral. As they approached, Elizabeth could hear Sarah's cries of pain even from outside. "You go to her," Yates told Elizabeth as they dismounted. "I'll ride on for the doctor." Elizabeth nodded, her mouth dry with fear but her resolve firm. "Hurry." Inside, she found Sarah writhing on a bed soaked with blood, her face gray with pain and blood loss. The sight made Elizabeth's stomach lurch, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Sarah, it's Elizabeth Lawson," she said, approaching the bed. "I'm here to help until the doctor arrives." Sarah's eyes, glazed with pain, focused briefly on Elizabeth's face. "The baby," she gasped. "It's too early, and something's wrong." "We'll get through this together," Elizabeth promised, though she had no idea if she could keep such a promise. She turned to Thomas, who hovered in the doorway, his face a mask of terror. "I need clean towels, hot water, and whiskey if you have it." While Thomas gathered the supplies, Elizabeth examined Sarah as best she could, drawing on dim memories of her cousin's birth and on common sense. The bleeding was indeed severe, and Sarah's pain seemed centered in her lower back rather than her abdomen, which Elizabeth knew was unusual. For the next 3 hours, Elizabeth worked tirelessly, applying pressure to slow the bleeding, bathing Sarah's forehead with cool cloths, and murmuring encouragement even as her own fear grew. Sarah's condition was deteriorating rapidly, her pulse becoming weaker and her periods of lucidity briefer. "Please," Thomas begged, holding his wife's limp hand, "do something." But there was nothing more Elizabeth could do except pray and wait for the doctor. When Sarah began to convulse, Elizabeth feared the worst. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, hoofbeats pounded in the yard, and moments later, Yates burst through the door with a gray-haired man carrying a medical bag. "Doc Peterson," the man introduced himself curtly, moving immediately to Sarah's bedside. "How long has she been like this?" "The convulsions started about 10 minutes ago," Elizabeth reported, stepping back to give the doctor room to work. "She's been bleeding heavily for at least 4 hours." The doctor examined Sarah quickly but thoroughly, his expression grim. "The placenta has separated from the womb. The baby's in distress and she's losing too much blood." He looked up at Thomas. "I need to operate immediately to save them both. I've done it before, but it's risky." Thomas, pale and shaking, nodded his consent. "Do whatever you have to." "I'll need help," the doctor said, opening his bag and removing a collection of instruments that made Elizabeth's stomach turn. "Mrs. Lawson, if you've got the stomach for it, I could use your assistance." Elizabeth swallowed hard but nodded. "Tell me what to do." The next hour was the most harrowing of Elizabeth's life. Under Dr. Peterson's terse instructions, she administered chloroform to keep Sarah unconscious, handed him instruments, and helped restrain the patient when the anesthetic wasn't quite sufficient. Yates had taken Thomas outside, for which Elizabeth was grateful no husband should have to witness such a scene. Finally, with a series of swift, decisive movements, Dr. Peterson delivered a tiny blue-tinged infant. "It's a girl," he announced, quickly clearing the baby's airways. For a terrible moment, there was silence, and then a thin, reedy cry filled the room. "She's alive," Elizabeth breathed, tears of relief streaming down her face. "The baby's alive. And so is the mother, though just barely," the doctor said, working rapidly to control Sarah's bleeding and close the incision. "She'll need careful nursing for weeks, but she should recover." When it was over, when Sarah was stable, and the newborn girl was swaddled and nursing weakly at her unconscious mother's breast, Elizabeth stepped outside onto the porch, her legs trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of fear. The sun was just rising, painting the eastern sky with streaks of pink and gold. Yates was sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. At the sound of the door, he looked up, his face haggard with worry. "Elizabeth, how are they?" "Alive," she said simply. "Both of them." "The doctor says Sarah will recover with proper care, and the baby, though small, is breathing well." Relief washed over Yates' features. He stood and crossed to her in 2 long strides, then, without warning, pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Thank God," he murmured against her hair. "And thank you. Thomas told me what you did before we arrived. You kept her alive until help could come." Elizabeth leaned into his strength, suddenly too tired to stand on her own. The events of the night, the fear, the blood, the desperate struggle to save 2 lives crashed over her like a wave, and she began to shake uncontrollably. "It's all right," Yates soothed, his arms tightening around her. "You're all right, it's over now." But it wasn't over, not really. Something fundamental had shifted during those terrifying hours. Elizabeth had discovered a strength in herself she hadn't known existed, a capacity for courage and decisive action that went beyond anything she'd experienced before. And something had changed between her and Yates as well. The barriers of politeness and uncertainty that had kept them at a careful distance were gone, swept away by the tide of shared crisis. "Take me home," Elizabeth whispered against his chest. "Take me home to Michael." Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The Hendersons are on their way to help with the Wilson boys and to look after Sarah. We can leave as soon as they arrive." The ride back to the Triple L was silent, both of them too exhausted for conversation. When they arrived, Maria met them at the door, Michael in her arms. "The little one is fine," she assured them. "He has been fed and is ready for his mama." Elizabeth took her son gratefully, breathing in his sweet, familiar scent. After the night's ordeal, holding him felt like a miracle in itself. "Thank you, Maria." "You look dead on your feet, both of you," Maria observed with motherly concern. "I will make breakfast, and then you must rest." After a quick meal that neither of them tasted, Yates insisted that Elizabeth lie down. "You've been up all night in the most trying circumstances. You need sleep." Elizabeth was too exhausted to argue. She retreated to her room, laid Michael in his cot, and fell across her bed still fully clothed. She awoke hours later to the golden light of late afternoon and the sound of Michael's hungry cries. After feeding and changing him, she ventured downstairs to find Yates sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling before him, his expression distant. "You're awake," he said, rising as she entered. "How do you feel?" "Better," Elizabeth admitted. "Still tired, but better." She settled Michael on her hip. "Have you had any word from the Wilsons? Ruth Henderson rode over about an hour ago. Sarah's weak but conscious, and the baby's holding her own. The doctor's staying another day to be sure, but he thinks they'll both recover fully." Yates' eyes softened as he looked at her. "He says it's largely thanks to you. If you hadn't been there to slow the bleeding until he arrived, Sarah would have died before he could help her." Elizabeth shook her head. "I did very little. It was the doctor who saved her." "That's not how Thomas tells it. He says you were calm and decisive when he was falling apart, says you kept Sarah fighting when she might have given up." Yates stepped closer, his gaze intent. "You're a remarkable woman, Elizabeth Lawson." The use of her married name, the warmth in his voice, and the admiration in his eyes made Elizabeth's pulse quicken. "I only did what anyone would have done in the circumstances." "No," Yates contradicted gently. "Not anyone would have ridden out in the middle of the night to help a woman they barely knew. Not anyone would have stayed steady through what you saw and did last night. It takes a special kind of courage." Before she could protest further, he reached out and touched her cheek, his calloused fingertips surprisingly soft against her skin. "I knew when I married you that you were strong. I didn't know how strong." The tenderness in his touch undid her. After the emotional maelstrom of the previous night, Elizabeth found herself leaning into his hand, seeking the comfort of human connection. "I was terrified," she confessed. "The whole time I was sure I was going to fail them. But you didn't." Yates moved closer still, his other hand coming to rest on Michael's back, creating a circle that enclosed the three of them. "That's real courage, Elizabeth. Not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it." In that moment, with the late afternoon sun gilding Yates' hair to gold and his blue eyes warm with admiration, Elizabeth made a decision. Rising on tiptoe, she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was both a thank you for his understanding and an invitation for something more. Yates responded immediately, his arms sliding around her waist, careful of Michael between them. The kiss deepened, becoming something heated and urgent until Michael squirmed and protested at being squeezed between two adults. They broke apart, both breathing harder than before. Yates' eyes had darkened to the color of a storm-tossed sea. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice rough, "tonight," she said simply. "After Michael is asleep, I'll come to you." Understanding and desire flashed across his face, followed by concern. "Are you sure?" "You don't have to, I'm sure," Elizabeth interrupted. "I want to be your wife, Yates, in every way." The smile that illuminated his face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie, sudden, brilliant, and full of promise. "Then I'll be waiting," he said softly. That night, After putting Michael to bed, Elizabeth took more care with her appearance than she had since arriving at the ranch. She brushed her hair until it shone, letting it fall loose around her shoulders rather than braiding it for sleep as she usually did. She washed with the rose-scented soap that had been a small luxury she'd allowed herself to purchase in San Angelo. And she chose her finest nightgown, a delicate creation of white cotton and lace that had been part of her trousseau from her first marriage, but had rarely been worn. When she entered Yates' room, a single lamp was burning on the bedside table, casting a warm, golden glow over the space. It was larger than her own room, with a massive 4-poster bed that must have been brought in pieces from the East, a feat of transportation that impressed her. Yates was standing by the window, looking out at the night, but he turned when he heard her enter. His eyes widened as he took in her appearance, her loose hair and the way the lamplight made her nightgown nearly transparent. "Elizabeth," he breathed, his voice husky with wonder and desire. "You're beautiful." Elizabeth had never felt beautiful, pretty perhaps in a conventional way, but not beautiful. Yet in Yates' eyes she saw herself transformed, and it gave her courage. "So are you," she said softly, and meant it. He had removed his shirt, and in the lamplight his torso gleamed like bronze, muscled from years of hard work on the ranch. A scattering of scars marked his skin, testimony to the dangers of his life, but they only added to his masculine appeal. Yates crossed the room to her, his movements deliberate but unhurried. He stopped just short of touching her, his eyes searching hers. "If at any point you want to stop, you only have to say so," he promised. "I never want you to feel obligated or afraid with me." The consideration in his words touched her deeply. Her first husband had never been cruel, but neither had he been particularly attentive to her comfort or pleasure. James had viewed the marital bed as his right and her duty, nothing more. "I know," she said simply, and reached for him. Their coming together was everything Elizabeth hadn't known to hope for, tender at first, as Yates explored her body with reverent hands, then increasingly passionate as she responded to his touch. He murmured endearments against her skin, telling her how beautiful she was, how he'd wanted her from the moment he first saw her in Martha Jensen's parlor. And when they finally joined, when he entered her with careful restraint that quickly gave way to mutual urgency, Elizabeth found herself swept away on a tide of pleasure more intense than anything she'd experienced before. It wasn't just physical satisfaction, though that was part of it. It was the emotional connection, the sense that they were truly becoming one flesh, one heart. Afterward they lay tangled together in the warm darkness, Yates' heartbeat strong and steady beneath her ear. "All right," he murmured, his hand stroking lazily up and down her back. "More than all right," Elizabeth assured him, pressing a kiss to his chest. "I never knew it could be like that." Yates' hand stilled. "Like what?" Elizabeth blushed, grateful for the dimness that hid her face. "So mutual." "My first husband, it was different," understanding dawned in Yates' eyes. "Ah, well, I believe that a man and wife should find pleasure together. It's not just the man's right and the woman's duty, whatever some folks might say." His arms tightened around her. "I want you to be happy, Elizabeth, in every way, including this one." The tenderness in his voice, the care in his touch, they undid her. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from a welling of emotion too complex to name. "I am happy," she whispered. "Happier than I ever expected to be when I married you." Yates kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss that rekindled the embers of desire. "Show me," he urged softly, and she did. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth and Yates settled into a new rhythm of married life. They now shared a bed each night, and Elizabeth found herself looking forward to the intimate hours of darkness when they could explore each other's bodies and hearts without reservation. During the day, Yates worked with his cattle and managed the ranch, while Elizabeth kept house, cared for Michael, and even began to help with some of the lighter ranch duties. She discovered she had a knack for the bookkeeping aspects of ranch management, and Yates was delighted to turn over the ledgers to her capable hands. Elizabeth found satisfaction in this work, applying her education to a practical purpose that helped the family. The word had come to mean something new to her now. Not just Michael, her son by blood, but Yates too, her husband by choice, becoming more essential to her happiness with each passing day. As autumn deepened toward winter, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain to the parched Texas landscape, Elizabeth realized with a start that she had been at the Triple L for nearly 3 months. In that short time, it had become more of a home to her than anywhere she'd lived since childhood. One evening in late November, as they sat before the fire after Michael had been put to bed, Yates broached a subject they hadn't discussed since their wedding day. "Christmas is coming in a few weeks," he said, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "I thought we might go into San Angelo for supplies and to visit the church, and perhaps—" He hesitated, then continued, "perhaps we could see about legally adopting Michael." Elizabeth looked up sharply from her mending. "Adopting, making him officially a Lawson." Yates met her gaze steadily. "If you agree, of course. I've come to think of him as my son in every way that matters. I'd like to make it official in the eyes of the law." Emotion clogged Elizabeth's throat. She had hoped, of course, that Yates would come to love Michael as his own, but she hadn't expected this formal acknowledgement, this public declaration of commitment. "You would do that for him? For us?" she managed to ask. "I would do anything for you both," Yates said simply. "Surely you know that by now." The plain truth of it, the depth of feeling evident in his voice and eyes, overwhelmed her. Elizabeth set aside her mending and crossed to kneel beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "Yates, I—" Words failed her. How could she express the gratitude, the affection, the growing love she felt for this man who had given her and her son not just shelter and security, but a true home and family? Instead of speaking, she rose up and kissed him, pouring all her tangled emotions into the physical connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Yates' eyes were dark with desire and something deeper. "Is that a yes?" he asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes," Elizabeth laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Yes, I would be honored for Michael to officially bear your name." The trip to San Angelo in mid-December was both practical and celebratory. They stayed at the Western Star Hotel, the same one where Elizabeth had spent her first night in town, though this time in considerably more comfort. Yates purchased gifts for Elizabeth and Michael, insisting that she not peek at the packages he stowed in their hotel room. The legal adoption process was simpler than Elizabeth had feared. With her full consent as the mother and no other living relatives to contest it, the judge signed the papers with a minimum of fuss. Michael Zamora officially became Michael Lawson, son of Yates and Elizabeth Lawson. As they left the courthouse, Elizabeth found herself blinking back tears. "Are you all right?" Yates asked, concerned. "Just happy," she assured him, bouncing Michael on her hip. The boy was growing rapidly, already trying to stand on his own and babbling a few recognizable words. "It feels right, him having your name." Yates smiled, the slow, warming smile that never failed to quicken her pulse. "It is right, the 3 of us together." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Come on, I have one more stop to make before we head back to the hotel." The stop turned out to be a jewelry store, where Yates selected a delicate gold band set with a small pearl. "I know I said we could replace your wedding ring if you wanted," he said as the jeweler wrapped the purchase. "But this isn't a replacement. It's a new beginning." That night, After they had put Michael to bed in a cot the hotel provided, Yates slipped the pearl ring onto Elizabeth's finger, alongside her plain gold wedding band. "I wanted to wait until Michael was officially our son," he explained. "Because this isn't just about us, Elizabeth. It's about the family we're building together." He took her hands in his expression unusually solemn. "When we married, it was a practical arrangement. You needed security for yourself and your child. I needed a wife to help manage my home and perhaps give me children of my own." Elizabeth nodded, remembering their business-like negotiations in Martha Jensen's parlor. "But it's become something else, at least for me," Yates continued, his voice lowered, becoming more intimate. "I love you, Elizabeth. Not just as the mother of my son, or as my helpmeet, but as the woman who has brought joy and meaning back into my life. I didn't expect to fall in love again after Rebecca died, but I have, deeply and completely." Elizabeth's heart swelled with emotion. She had known, of course, that Yates cared for her. His tenderness in bed, his consideration for her comfort, his growing affection for Michael, all these spoke of genuine feeling. But to hear the words, to see the vulnerability in his eyes as he declared his love, was overwhelming. "I love you too, Yates," she whispered, the words coming easily, naturally, as if they had always been there, waiting to be spoken. "I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you offered to take in a stranger and her child and give them a home. Not because you had to, but because that's who you are, a man of honor and kindness and strength." The kiss they shared then was different from any they had exchanged before, deeper, richer, infused with the knowledge that this was no longer a marriage of convenience but a true union of hearts. Later, as they lay entwined in the hotel bed, Yates traced idle patterns on Elizabeth's bare shoulder. "I've been thinking," he said softly. "Now that Michael has my name, we should consider giving him a brother or sister." Elizabeth propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, a smile playing about her lips. "Are you saying you want us to have a baby?" "I'm saying I want us to have a family," Yates corrected. "A big, noisy, loving family that fills the house with laughter and chaos. I've had enough of quiet and loneliness to last a lifetime." The vision he painted was so appealing, so aligned with Elizabeth's own deepest desires, that she felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I would like that very much," she managed to say. "Well then," Yates murmured, pulling her closer, "perhaps we should start practicing." Christmas at the Triple L was a joyous affair. They had invited the Wilsons and Hendersons as well as Diego and Maria to share the holiday feast. Sarah Wilson, fully recovered from her difficult delivery, was radiant as she showed off her thriving baby girl, named Elizabeth in honor of the woman who had helped save her life. The house was decorated with greenery from the cottonwoods along the creek and candles in every window. Elizabeth had baked for days, preparing pies and cakes and cookies to supplement the roast turkey and ham that formed the centerpiece of the meal. After dinner, they gathered in the main room, where Yates had set up a small pine tree decorated with paper ornaments that Elizabeth and Maria had crafted. Beneath it were presents for everyone, practical gifts mostly, like knitted scarves and gloves, books, and small toys for the children. Michael, now able to toddle a few steps on his own, was delighted with the wooden rocking horse Yates had commissioned from a craftsman in San Angelo. He spent the evening alternating between riding it enthusiastically and crawling from lap to lap, charming all the guests with his sunny disposition. As the evening wound down and their friends prepared to leave, Henry Henderson raised his glass in a toast. "To the Lawsons," he said, his weathered face creased in a warm smile. "May your home always be as full of love and laughter as it is tonight." "Hear, hear," echoed Thomas Wilson, his arm around his wife's shoulders. And may there be more little Lawsons to join young Michael before too long. Elizabeth blushed at the good-natured teasing, but Yates just smiled and drew her closer to his side. "From your mouth to God's ears, Thomas," he said, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. Later, after the guests had departed and Michael was asleep in his cot, Yates and Elizabeth stood together on the porch, watching the winter stars glitter in the clear night sky. The temperature had dropped, but Yates' arm around her shoulders kept Elizabeth warm. "Happy?" he asked, his breath forming small clouds in the frosty air. "Very," she assured him, leaning into his solid strength. "It was a perfect Christmas." "The first of many," Yates promised. He turned her to face him, his expression suddenly serious. "I was thinking today about when we first met, about what you said was your reason for agreeing to marry me." Elizabeth remembered her own words. "I'm not just looking for a husband. I'm looking for security for my son." "You married to keep your child safe," Yates continued, "and I respect that. It shows what kind of mother you are willing to sacrifice your own happiness for his well-being." "It wasn't really a sacrifice," Elizabeth began, but Yates placed a gentle finger on her lips. "Let me finish. You married for Michael's sake, and I married because I needed a wife. But what we've found together is so much more than either of us was looking for." His blue eyes were intense in the moonlight. "I want you to know that you succeeded, Elizabeth. Michael is safe here and loved and always will be." "And so are you." Elizabeth's heart swelled with emotion. "I know," she whispered. Yates pulled her closer, his voice deepening. "Then you'll both stay forever." It wasn't a question, but Elizabeth answered anyway, rising on tiptoe to brush her lips against his. "Forever," she agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. As the new year of 1879 dawned, life at the Triple L settled into a rhythm of quiet contentment punctuated by moments of joy. Michael continued to grow and thrive, taking his first confident steps on his own and expanding his vocabulary to include Mama, Papa, his name for Yates, which never failed to bring a proud smile to the rancher's face, and a variety of other simple words. Elizabeth found herself increasingly involved in the operations of the ranch, not just keeping the books, but also offering suggestions for improvements based on articles she read in agricultural journals. Yates listened to her ideas with respect and implemented many of them, from new breeding techniques for the cattle to more efficient methods of storing feed for the winter months. Their partnership, which had begun as a practical arrangement, had blossomed into something much deeper, a true marriage of equals, bound by love, respect, and shared purpose. In late February, as the first hints of spring began to soften the Texas landscape, Elizabeth woke one morning feeling distinctly unwell. She barely made it to the wash basin before emptying the contents of her stomach. Yates, still in bed, sat up in alarm. "Elizabeth, what's wrong?" "Nothing," she assured him, wiping her mouth with a damp cloth. "Just a touch of nausea. It'll pass." But when the same thing happened the next morning and the next, Yates insisted that she see Dr. Peterson, who was making his monthly rounds of the outlying ranches. The doctor examined Elizabeth in the privacy of their bedroom, asking questions about her symptoms and the date of her last monthly flow. When he emerged, he was smiling. "Congratulations, Mr. Lawson. Your wife is expecting a child. I'd estimate the baby will arrive in early October." Yates' face transformed with joy. He swept Elizabeth into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm. "A baby, our baby," Elizabeth laughed, his excitement infectious despite her lingering queasiness. "Yes, our baby. But please put me down before I'm sick again." The months of pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Yates was solicitous to the point of hovering, especially after Elizabeth experienced some spotting in her 4th month that frightened them both. Dr. Peterson ordered rest, and Yates enforced it rigidly, taking over many of Elizabeth's household duties despite her protests. "I'm pregnant, not invalid," she complained one afternoon as he insisted on carrying a basket of laundry that she was perfectly capable of managing. "Humor me," Yates said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I nearly lost my first wife. I'm not taking any chances with you." The raw emotion in his voice silenced Elizabeth's objections. She understood that his protectiveness stemmed from love and fear, not a desire to control her. And truly, she was touched by his concern, even when it occasionally chafed against her independent nature. As her belly swelled with new life, Elizabeth found herself reflecting often on the strange path that had brought her to this place and time. If James hadn't died, if his creditors hadn't pursued her so relentlessly, if she hadn't seen that advertisement in the newspaper, any deviation in that chain of events would have led her somewhere else, to a different life entirely. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Michael, now a sturdy toddler of nearly 18 months, seemed to understand that something important was happening. He patted Elizabeth's growing belly with gentle hands and listened with solemn attention when she explained that a baby brother or sister was growing inside. "Baby," he would say, pointing to her middle. "Michael's baby." "That's right," Elizabeth would agree, charmed by his proprietary attitude. "Your baby brother or sister." By the time autumn arrived, Elizabeth was more than ready for the pregnancy to end. Her back ached constantly, her ankles were swollen, and she could barely manage to find a comfortable position for sleeping. But there was also a sense of eager anticipation, a readiness to meet this new life that she and Yates had created together. The labor began on a crisp October morning, just as the sun was rising over the eastern horizon. Elizabeth had been restless all night, unable to find comfort, and as the first contraction gripped her, she knew this was not the false labor she'd experienced several times in the preceding weeks. "Yates," she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. "It's time." He was instantly alert, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I'll send Diego for the doctor and Maria to help you. What do you need right now?" "Just help me walk a bit," Elizabeth said, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "The movement helps with the pain." For the next several hours, Elizabeth paced the bedroom, stopping to lean on Yates or the bedpost when contractions seized her. Maria arrived, bringing calming herbal teas and practical advice based on her own 5 childbirths. Dr. Peterson arrived mid-afternoon, by which time the contractions were coming stronger and closer together. After examining Elizabeth, he nodded approvingly. "Everything's progressing normally. The baby's head is down, and your body is opening as it should." Still, the labor continued well into the evening and through the night. Elizabeth lost track of time, focusing only on the rhythm of pain and respite, pain and respite. Yates never left her side, supporting her as she walked, rubbing her back when she needed it, offering sips of water or spoonfuls of broth to keep up her strength. As dawn broke on the second day, Elizabeth felt an overwhelming urge to push. Dr. Peterson, who had dozed in a chair by the fire during the night, was immediately at her side. "It's time," he confirmed after a quick examination. "The baby's coming now." The pain intensified to a level Elizabeth hadn't imagined possible, but with it came a surge of determination and strength. She bore down with all her might, encouraged by the doctor's calm instructions and Yates' unwavering support. "I can see the head," Dr. Peterson announced. "One more big push, Mrs. Lawson." With a final, monumental effort, Elizabeth felt the baby slide from her body, and then the room was filled with the lusty cries of a newborn. "It's a boy," the doctor said, placing the squalling infant on Elizabeth's chest. "A fine, healthy son." Exhausted but exhilarated, Elizabeth gazed down at the red-faced, indignant little person in her arms. He had a shock of dark hair like hers, but when he briefly opened his eyes, she caught a glimpse of blue that promised to match his father's. "He's perfect," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Absolutely perfect." Yates, who had been holding her hand throughout the delivery, reached out to touch his son's tiny fist with one finger. The baby immediately grasped it, his grip surprisingly strong for one so small. "Hello, son," Yates said, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome to the world." They named him William James Lawson William after Yates' father, and James in memory of Elizabeth's first husband, a gesture that touched her deeply. Will, as they came to call him, was a robust, healthy baby with a hearty appetite and a tendency to make his needs known at the top of his lungs. Michael, after initial wariness, became fascinated with his baby brother. He would sit beside Elizabeth as she nursed Will, patting the baby's head with careful gentleness and bringing his own toys to share. Though Will was far too young to appreciate the gesture. The winter of 1879-1880 was one of the happiest of Elizabeth's life. The Triple L was prospering, with the cattle herd growing and the year's profits exceeding expectations. The house, once so empty and quiet when Yates lived there alone, was now filled with the sounds of family life: Michael's excited chatter, Will's cries and coos, Yates' deep laughter, and Elizabeth's piano playing, which had become a regular evening ritual. On Christmas Eve, after the children were asleep, Yates and Elizabeth sat before the fire, sharing a glass of the fine whiskey he kept for special occasions. "You remember our first meeting?" Yates asked suddenly, his blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Elizabeth smiled at the memory. "In Martha Jensen's parlor, you were so formal and I was so terrified." "Terrified?" Yates looked surprised. "You seemed composed to me, a little reserved perhaps, but not frightened." "I was petrified," Elizabeth admitted. "I had a 7-month-old baby, no money, no prospects, and I was about to tie myself to a complete stranger out of sheer desperation." She shook her head at the recollection. "If someone had told me then that within 2 years I'd be happily married with another child, living on a thriving ranch, I wouldn't have believed them." Yates reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand. "If someone had told me that the quiet, proper widow I met that day would become the center of my world, I might not have believed them either." His grip tightened, but I would have hoped they were right. Elizabeth rose from her chair and moved to sit on his lap, a liberty she would never have dreamed of taking in the early days of their marriage. "They would have been right," she murmured, kissing him softly. "We found each other when we both needed someone most, and somehow, against all odds, it turned out to be exactly right." Yates' arms came around her, holding her close. "Not somehow," he corrected. "Providence. God had a plan for us, Elizabeth. For you, for me, for Michael and Will." Elizabeth laid her head on his shoulder, content in the knowledge that he was right. What had begun as a marriage of necessity, she seeking safety for her child, he seeking a partner for his life, had transformed into something far more profound. A true love match, a family built on mutual respect and deepening affection, a home filled with warmth and hope. As the fire crackled and the winter wind sang around the eaves of the house they shared, Elizabeth silently gave thanks for the journey that had brought her here. She had married to keep her child safe, and in doing so had found not just security but love, purpose, and a future brighter than any she could have imagined. And they would indeed stay forever. In the years that followed, the Triple L Ranch flourished, as did the Lawson family. Elizabeth gave birth to two more children, a daughter, Rebecca Ruth, named after Yates' first wife and Ruth Henderson, who had become like a grandmother to the Lawson children, and another son, Thomas Henry, named for their friends the Wilsons and Hendersons. Michael grew into a thoughtful, responsible young man with a gift for working with horses. Though he knew from an early age that Yates was not his biological father, he never felt anything less than a true son of the house. The legal adoption Yates had arranged when Michael was still a baby was merely a formality. In his heart and mind, Yates was his father in every way that mattered. Will, so like his father in appearance and temperament, developed an interest in cattle breeding and ranch management from a young age. By the time he was 12, he was accompanying Yates on cattle drives and absorbing everything he could about the business. Rebecca, with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes, inherited Elizabeth's love of music and books. She played the piano beautifully and had a sweet singing voice that made her a favorite at church gatherings. Thomas, the baby of the family, was a sunny-natured child with a mischievous streak and a talent for finding trouble, but his genuine remorse and affectionate nature made it impossible to stay angry with him for long. The Triple L expanded over the years, with Yates purchasing adjacent properties as they became available. By 1890, it was one of the largest and most profitable ranches in the county, known for its quality livestock and progressive farming methods. Elizabeth's role on the ranch grew as well. What had begun as simple bookkeeping expanded to include correspondence with buyers, management of household staff. As the ranch grew, so did the number of hands and domestic help needed to run it, and even occasional representation of the Triple L at agricultural fairs and cattle auctions when Yates couldn't attend. They faced challenges, of course, droughts that threatened the cattle, economic downturns that affected beef prices, illnesses and injuries that were part of frontier life. But they faced them together, their partnership stronger for each obstacle overcome. Their friends marveled at the success of their arranged marriage. "Never seen two people better suited," Henry Henderson often remarked. "It's like they were made for each other, just took the long way round to finding it out." On their 20th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Elizabeth with a trip to Boston, her first return to her childhood home since leaving it as a young bride. They stayed in a fine hotel, attended the opera and visited museums, and Elizabeth showed Yates all the places that had been important in her early life. "Do you ever regret it?" Yates asked as they stood on the common, looking out over the city. "Leaving all this for a dusty ranch in Texas?" Elizabeth looked up at him, at the face she had come to know as well as her own, still handsome despite the lines of age and weather, still capable of making her heart quicken with a single glance. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment." And it was true. The path that had led her to Yates had been winding and at times painful, but she wouldn't change a step of it. Each hardship, each loss, each decision had been necessary to bring them together, to create the life they now shared. In the autumn of 1900, as a new century dawned, Elizabeth and Yates celebrated their silver wedding anniversary with a grand party at the Triple L. Friends and family gathered from near and far. Michael, now married with a child of his own. Will, engaged to the daughter of a neighboring rancher. Rebecca, home from her studies at a women's college in the East. And Thomas, at 16 still living at home but already showing signs of the man he would become. As twilight fell, Yates led Elizabeth away from the festivities to the porch where they had spent so many evenings together over the years. In his hand was a small velvet box. "Another ring." Elizabeth teased, remembering the pearl ring he had given her in San Angelo so many years ago, a ring she still wore every day alongside her wedding band. "Not exactly," Yates said, opening the box to reveal a delicate gold locket. Inside were two tiny portraits, one of them on their wedding day, the other a recent photograph of their entire family. "To remind you of where we started and how far we've come." As he fastened the locket around her neck, Elizabeth was struck by a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. 25 years, she murmured. Who would have thought that day in Martha Jensen's parlor that we'd be standing here now? Yates' arms came around her, as strong and sure as they had always been. "I hoped," he said simply. "From the moment I saw you with Michael in your arms, trying so hard to be brave for his sake, I hoped that we might find not just an arrangement, but a life together." Elizabeth leaned into his embrace, thinking of all they had shared, the births of their children, the growth of their ranch, the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and challenges. A full life, a rich life, a life built on a foundation of mutual respect that had blossomed into enduring love. "We found more than a life," she said softly, turning in his arms to face him. "We found a love story." Yates smiled, the same slow, warming smile that had first captured her heart. "And it's not over yet," he promised, bending to kiss her as the stars began to emerge in the vast Texas sky. Indeed, their story continued for many years more through the marriages of their children, the births of grandchildren, the changes that the new century brought to ranching and to Texas. Through it all, Elizabeth and Yates remained what they had become in those early days at the Triple L: partners, lovers, friends. A man and woman who had married for practical reasons but had discovered, in each other's arms, the truest meaning of "until death do us part." And when Yates passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, Elizabeth, though heartbroken, found comfort in the knowledge that their love story would live on in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch that bore their name, and in the community they had helped to build. "He said we'd both stay forever," she told Michael as they stood together at Yates' grave. "And we did." Michael, his own hair now streaked with gray, put his arm around his mother's shoulders. "He's still with us, Ma, in everything we are, in everything the Triple L has become." "That kind of love doesn't end." Elizabeth nodded, her hand going to the locket she still wore every day. "No," she agreed softly, "that kind of love is forever." And in the depths of her heart, where memories of Yates remained as vivid as the day they met, Elizabeth knew it was true. The cowboy who had offered her shelter in her darkest hour, who had loved her son as his own, who had built with her a life of purpose and joy, that man would indeed stay with her forever, just as he had promised.